Well, good morning, everyone, once again. This morning, as I mentioned, I'm speaking on the life of Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was born on this day, January 15th, and if he was still alive, he would be 94 years old today. And because tomorrow is a national holiday honoring his life, I wanted to explore his legacy as one of history's most inspiring and influential civil rights leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. Was many things. He was a reverend. He was an intellectual. He was a great orator, a powerful political force, and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And he was just an incredibly inspiring leader. And he was, to me, a bodhisattva. You know, early on, he knew he had a purpose. He knew he had a dharma, and he lived with that purpose ever driving him. He saw the darkness in this world that needed light. He said, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hatred cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And so he brought the light. He was the light. And he enlightened society of its injustice, of its racism and inequality, and its need for change, its need for evolution and awakening. Martin grew up in a middle-class family, and his dad was a well-known Baptist preacher. And Martin wrote in his autobiography, of course, I was religious. I grew up in the church. My father's a preacher. My grandfather was a preacher. My great-grandfather was a preacher. My only brother was a preacher. My daddy's brother is a preacher. So I didn't have much choice. Um, after after Martin completed studies at Morehouse College, he went to Crozer Theological Seminary, which was in Pennsylvania. And he wrote that he was drawn to that school because of its unorthodox reputation and its liberal theological leanings. There's a story about how when Martin was in seminary, he read a book that really had a huge effect on him called Christianity and the Social Crisis. It was by Walter Rauschenbusch. And Walter's writings were basically that, you know, they were so much more about social justice. And, you know, they were about how Jesus was teaching us how to live life now, right? Not so much the future in heaven. Walter wrote, Christianity is in its nature revolutionary. And he tried to remind society of that in his writings. He said that Jesus was saying that the kingdom of God is not a matter of getting individuals to heaven. It's a matter of transforming the life on earth into the harmony of heaven. You know, that point to me is so powerful. It's not about heaven and eternal life in the future. It's about how do we live now to bring about more social justice, more love, more equality to all of humanity. And so Martin took that ball and ran with it, and you know, he was influenced by that view. And when you read or you listen to his sermons or his speeches, it's clear that he interprets Jesus's teachings as a vehicle for social justice on earth, not just in heaven. I've been reading Martin's autobiography, and it's really fascinating to me. It's this whole week I've just been immersed in. Went to the library and just got all the books I could find, and just learned some new things about him, and just kind of feeling into like what formed him, what formed the way that he thinks, and the way he grew up to act and become such a force for change. There's one story that's especially powerful about his childhood. He shares that from the age of about 3 years old, he had a white playmate that was about his age. And they felt free to play childhood games together. And though the little friend didn't live in Martin's neighborhood, his father owned a store across the street. And so the boy was around every day, and they played and played. And then they both turned 6 years old, and they entered different schools because blacks and whites were segregated back then. And Martin shares that their friendship started to break, and that, this wasn't his desire, but it was his friends, and that it completely ended one day when Martin's friend told him that his father demanded that he no longer play with Martin. And this was an incredible shock to him, and he immediately ran to his parents and he asked them, why would his friend and his friend's father do such a thing? And so they talked about it, sitting around the dinner table. And for the first time, Martin was made aware of the existence of a race problem. He'd never been conscious of it before. He was just a child, an innocent child, and didn't know that about the world. But his parents talked about, some of the tragedies that had come from racism and about their own experiences with insults. And so Martin was shocked. He was just deeply shocked, and he was hurt. And it stayed with him. It had a big impact on his life. And years later, when he had already become this powerful force in the civil rights movement in the 60s, he was in jail in Birmingham for leading an anti-segregation protest. And he wrote in a letter, that famous letter from Birmingham jail, he wrote, let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. So beautiful. His words, his speeches, his mind, his heart were so potent. And I would say it's because they were true. He spoke the truth, but he spoke from a place of love. He saw justice as an aspect of love. Fairness is an aspect of love. To treat people fairly and justly, that's an aspect of loving kindness. Of course, one of his greatest speeches was the I Have a Dream speech, which he gave at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And, I read that speech this week. It's incredibly powerful. And what I found especially powerful in that speech is he uses this analogy of coming to the nation's capital to cash a check. He said that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence was actually a promissory note to all Americans. And he pointed out that it was a promise to black men as well as white men. And, I would add, for that matter, black women as well as white women, that everyone of every race of Americans would be guaranteed that unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. King said, it is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. And he went on to say, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon the demand, riches of freedom and the security of justice. The security of justice, freedom and justice. This is so powerful. We've grown up, if we've grown up with privilege, we often don't even know we're privileged, right? It's just been our normal, right? We just probably most of us have had opportunities of a good education, been able to go to college or a good living and a fair justice system. That's probably how we've experienced our system. And we don't I think know what it's like to live with systemic injustice and unfairness of being treated as less than simply because of our race, as somehow less deserving or somehow less worthy of respect and of life's opportunities. And I was thinking, as I was reflecting on this, because my heart has been so involved in this question of why is it the way it is and why was it the way it is. I was thinking we don't come into this world with any racism. You know, that little white boy that was Martin's friend, he didn't care about skin tone. He just wanted to play with his friend and enjoy their time together. He had to be taught actually by his father to see difference, to see a difference, to have that judgment and to somehow justify not being friends anymore. And to me, it's heartbreaking that the human race has not yet eradicated racism, um, and that we have not yet evolved collectively enough to let love and unity be our North Star. I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I know you all, we just spoke our commitment to love and unity, and we live that. But it is a work in progress, and it's a work in progress for the collective, for humanity as a collective. Another inspiring human rights leader, Nelson Mandela, he put it best, I think, when he said, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." I love that quote. Nelson Mandela admired Martin Luther King Jr. As a freedom fighter. He borrowed his phrase, "free at last." It's another beautiful gospel song. When South Africa was freed from apartheid, he borrowed that phrase. And you know the story. Mandela spent 27 years in prison. Um, and upon his release, he was refined. He was ready, and he was able to lead South Africa into winning the right for everyone, for all races to vote. And then, of course, they voted him in as president. But Mandela and King, they were a lot alike. They were two of the most inspiring spiritual and political figures in recent history. One of the articles I read this week was from the Washington Post about these kids that went to church summer camp, and part of their curriculum was learning about Martin Luther King Jr. And they asked the 9-year-olds students what they'd like to ask Martin if he was still here. And one student replied, Dontrell replied, "I would like to ask Martin Luther King Jr. if he was still living, would he still be marching for civil rights and segregation and racism? Because most of all, I would ask Dr. King if he would mentor me and show me right from wrong." Hmm. You know, part of what I find so personally inspiring and enduring about Martin and his legacy was the way his spirituality and his heart guided him in how he led. He was deeply rooted in love and in the principles of nonviolence. And he stuck to that, though throughout his whole entire life, he had to deal with violence being done to him. And when you read about his biggest influences, part of his view, a big part of his view, came particularly from being inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. We just said Gandhi's prayer for peace. That was very, very influential for Dr. King. Gandhi's concept of satyagraha. Satya is truth, Graha is force or power in Sanskrit. So it means using the force of truth or the power of truth and the power of love. And Satyagraha is basically a way that oppressed people can use truth, the power of truth and love as weapons, really, in the struggle for justice. Um, Martin especially used this Satyagraha, this nonviolent force, in the Montgomery bus boycott. I'm sure you know about that. He led that boycott by affirming that it's possible to resist evil without resorting to violence. He said it's possible to oppose evil itself without opposing the people committing evil. You know, that's such a powerful spiritual teaching. You know, we've heard iterations of that. You know, we can not love someone's behavior and we can still love that person, right? So we don't have to close our heart down, right? Um, we could abhor someone's harmful actions without hating that person. And you know, Martin's childhood friend is a good example. That little boy was taught to judge. He was taught to withdraw his love and friendship. I mean, we don't want to hate him for that, but we can abhor the racist view, the wrong view, the harmful view that his father passed on to him. Martin wrote that, you know, people who practice nonviolence must be willing to suffer without retaliation, internal or external. You know, the internal part is, you know, he said the nonviolent resistor not only refuses to shoot his opponent, but he also refuses to hate him. You know, so much like Gandhi's teaching. So, you know, he saw that this resolve to not respond with violence, to not respond to hate with hate, as a way of convincing people of the rightness of the cause. So, you know, Martin led that bus boycott in Montgomery, and people stopped using public buses for 2 years until the government agreed to stop the segregation. The segregation of having the whites sit up front and the blacks sit in the back, or else stand, or else not get on the bus. And I would imagine that that effort, you know, included a lot of sacrifice for the people choosing not to use the buses, but it worked. And the Supreme Court finally ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. And Martin, soon after, he told a crowd in Brooklyn, Christ showed us the way, and Gandhi showed us it could work. I've been contemplating that and pondering that statement. You know, Christ showed us the way to love our neighbor. Same in you, same in me. Love our neighbor as the same. You know, treat them, him or her, as an equal, right, in the eyes of God. And then Gandhi showed us how to use nonviolent resistance to resist a law that's just plain wrong, right, that treats one race as less than the other. So that Satyagraha, that power of truth, the power of love is there. Because we know in our bones that all people, that every race, every sex, every sexual orientation, every human being has a right to life and happiness and fairness. I was thinking, you know, justice. I was thinking about justice as a quality of love. You know, I don't often think of that, but it really is. And I was thinking that justice is like the air we breathe. It's just something everyone should have unquestionable access to, right? Air, right? Oxygen. You know, could you imagine someone saying, you know, actually some people should have more of a right to air than others? You know, it's just, it's absurd. It doesn't make sense. Another amazing man who stood for justice was the late Congressman John Lewis. He was also deeply inspired by Gandhi, and he was good friends with Martin. Um, and in his memoir, John Lewis wrote, if you can understand and feel, even in the midst of those critical and often physically painful moments, that your attacker is as much a victim as you are, that he is a victim of the forces that have shaped and fed his anger and fury. If you can understand that, then you're well on your way to the nonviolent life. Our focus here is on nonviolence. We practice nonviolent communication. It's a big piece of our spiritual practice. When I reflect on the life of Dr. King and all that he was trying to do, it makes me feel like we need a deeper understanding of the root causes of hatred and racism. It's not an easy thing to contemplate and to be with and to open our heart to, but we need understanding. Understanding is the beginning of love. And, in my opinion, so much of the problem is conditioning. It's the conditioning, like that little boy that was told, don't be friends with him. And conditioning, any way that we're conditioned that limits us, it takes a lot of personal work to unravel that conditioning. And it takes a lot of collective work to uproot the conditioning in society and the causes, of the suffering. Martin spoke to this when he wrote, people fail to get along because they fear each other. And they fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. You've heard me repeat the teaching so many times that it's from Thich Nhat Hanh that understanding is the beginning of love. That it's hard to understand someone. I mean, it's hard to love someone if you don't understand them. You don't understand what their needs are. So to understand each other, we have to want to communicate. We have to want to listen and speak from the heart and hear from the heart. There's another wonderful story. I actually found a book on this story, and that is the friendship between Martin Luther King Jr. and Thich Nhat Hanh. It's a beautiful friendship and a beautiful, powerful story. A few years before Martin was assassinated, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote an open letter to Martin. This is before they met, and he in the letter he expressed this effort to raise awareness about the horrors of the war that was happening in Vietnam, because Thich Nhat Hanh was from Vietnam. That was his beloved country. And the unexpected outcome was Martin responded, and the two men got together. They met and got together in 1966 and 67, and they not only became strong allies in the peace movement, but they became close friends. And here were two powerful spiritual leaders. They were also leaders for social justice, and they were from different religions. One was Buddhist, one was Christian. They were different cultures. They were from countries that were at the time at war with each other. And that just blows my mind that they became such close friends. That was such a powerful mirror, such a powerful example. And, their friendship reached a great depth in a short time. Dr. King nominated Thich Nhat Hanh for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1967. This is what he wrote. He said, Thich Nhat Hanh is a holy man. He is a humble and devout man. He's a scholar of immense intellectual capacity. His ideas for peace, if applied, would build a monument to ecumenism, to world brotherhood, to humanity. King saw Thich Nhat Hanh, and he was very young back then. The day after Martin Luther King was assassinated, which happened in '68, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a heartbroken letter to their mutual friend, Raphael Gord. He said, I did not sleep last night. They killed Martin Luther King. They killed us. I am afraid the root of violence is so deep in the heart and mind and manner of this society. They killed him. They killed my hope. I do not know what to say. He made so great an impression on me. This morning, I have the impression that I cannot bear the loss. In studying Dr. King this week, and being deeply touched by his amazing spirit, my heart just wants to know why. Like I've just been with that question this week. Why was this the outcome? Why did this great man not have more years to bless and change this world? And, part of the answer that comes inside is that man fears what he does not understand. And he feels threatened by love that expresses in a desire for justice. When I ask myself, why were people so fearful of equal rights for those of color? And why are so many still fearful? Um, I think in part it comes from the erroneous view that if some have more opportunity, that somehow others will have less. Or if someone can become more educated, somehow, others will be threatened. Or if someone can sit up in front of a bus, then someone else will get a lesser seat. It's really based on fear. It's fear thinking. It's limited thinking. It's that thinking there's only so much, right? So we have to covet or we have to subjugate. And it's such a different view when we look with the eyes of love. We can see that it's the wrong view. It's erroneous thinking because we as humanity, um, we have enough. We have enough if we live from love, right? And that is the teaching of all the great enlightened masters. Rise above separation, rise above separation consciousness, um, and change. It reminds me of that Jewish parable of the long spoons. You might have heard that story. It's a story about this man that gets to visit both heaven and hell and see what's going on there. And in hell, he sees that everyone's sitting around this big giant table, and it's this delicious buffet of all the most beautiful food. But the people sitting around, they're not eating, and they're starving, and they're looking haggard, and it's because they have these really long spoons, and they can't get the food into their mouths. And so then the man goes and he visits heaven, and he sees that in heaven there's the same big giant table. It's this delicious buffet of the most beautiful food you've ever seen. But all the people are happy and they're smiling and they're eating and they're healthy. And that is because they were feeding each other with those very long spoons. They figured out how to cooperate, how to work together, and how to lovingly feed one another and take care of one another. I really love that teaching, that story. It's really saying there is enough for all beings to live in peace if we live in the ways of love, if we desire to give more than we take, and if we desire that all beings have their needs met, and we work towards that. And also, if we overcome greed and excess and live on this earth wisely, only taking what we need. So, in closing, I hope you find inspiration in this brief, ever so brief tribute to the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And I ask you to hold in prayer, hold with me in your heart of hearts, that we as humanity can uproot all racism and its causes, that we can honor and love one another as equally, all made in the image and likeness of the Creator. Um, May the power of truth and justice and love prevail. And may all beings be happy and be at peace. Om Shanti. Om Peace.
Thank you, Kathy.